Hi, yes, I'm Phoebe. I'm from the BBC. I'm a software engineer there. A bit about me. The team I work in, we build the tools for BBC journalists across the world. So their content sort of management, as well as building the actual APIs that serve the websites and the apps that obviously you're accustomed with the BBC. I'm also a director of Lesbians Who Tech London, which is an organisation for LGBTQ plus women and non-binary people, as well as allies. So if anyone's interested at all or wants to know more about that, come on over and ask me a bit about that later. So it's called Let's Get Thunk-y. I just couldn't resist. It's not really that much about thunk. I just thought it was a fabulous name. So what is it going to be about then? So we will be covering thunk. What it's about is I want to get people beyond the step of just hello world. Applications nowadays, they're getting much more complicated. You're dealing with more and more data. It's becoming an issue for some companies. So I thought I'll give a brief overview for the people who aren't familiar with Redux. So what is Redux? It manages the application state. And why is this becoming more and more important? So as single-page applications are sort of on the rise, more and more companies are using them, the code must manage its own state. And you have so many different things going on. You've got maybe pagination, you have the sort of app updating itself, and you've got this local data. Maybe you have spinners. There's all these different things going on in your single page app. And how can you manage all of them? How can you keep track of all of them, especially if one sort of action leads on to another? And that's what Redux ultimately solves. So I have, for today, created a very simple app. And of course, it is called, let's get to it, Let's Get Thunk-y. So let's get thunk-y. So I thought this would be a good basic introduction for people who aren't familiar with Redux for the next talk. So what do we have here? We have a basic input. And what this is doing, I've hooked it up to an API endpoint, an external API service called Music's Match, where you can search by artist name or lyrics or anything like that. And what this is going to be doing is every time I type a letter in that box, in that input, it's going to make a request to that API endpoint. And hopefully, if all things work out well, you'll then get a list of those results. So if I type in, hey, and you can see there we've got the loader, and now we've got our results. And all of this is being managed by Redux. So this is the example that I'm going to be going through today with you all. So what did we just see? We saw the fetching, and that was the loader. We saw the success, which was the lovely list of results. And luckily for me, no failure, so we don't get an error message. But these are all the things that you would want to either show to the user, or maybe especially with failures, you'll maybe want to log it for yourself as a software engineer to track why has it failed. Or maybe you have a requirement for audits, and again, you want to log all of these different states, all of these different actions to check the process. So all of this we're going to be going through. So a basic overflow of Redux before we jump in with the different sort of areas of sort of what makes up Redux. So Redux is a state management, and thus you store the state in the store. So you have the store. It holds the state. My app, I've chosen React. You don't have to do it with React. But in this scenario, how it works is you have your React components. You have your state in the store. The state, then you pass it down to the components as props. And then there are two ways that you can interact with the store. One is just reading the state, so that's passing it in as props. The other one is dispatching actions, and all these terms I'll come to later if you're not familiar with them. So components can dispatch action creators, ultimately actions. And then these actions, which are plain JavaScript objects, are passed into reducers, which in turn updates the state, which will then make the component re-render as that maybe bit of the state is passed to that component. So if that doesn't all make quite clear sense to you, we're going to be walking through all the different stages now. So, synchronous action creators. Most people, if you've had maybe a little glimpse into the Redux world, you'll be familiar with actions. So that's in the white there, that plain JavaScript object. And you can see here the action type is add track. If you're not familiar with ES6 notation, that's just saying for track, the key is track, and the value is also track, which is the parameter that's being passed in. So all it is, an action creator wraps an action. It's just a function that returns an action. And this is a pure function. So you can pass in any string in there. So that this would be an example of typing in, hey there, as a song maybe. And you're always going to get the same output. So in the example that we looked at, that I showed you, let's get thunk-y, there was a couple of things that was going on there. We had fetching. So as an action, what would you want to know? You'd want to know, OK, we're about to get those tracks. You then want to know when you've got the tracks, so get track success. And then, sadly, you also want to know when there's been a failure. So let's have a quick look at that code. So you can see here, in my file structure, I have a folder called actions. And I've created a file called fetch track status. So these are all our synchronous action creators. So you can see our start get tracks. And that very simply is just we don't need to know anything other than this action has occurred. And that action is type get tracks. We then have get track success. Again, returning that object with the tracks as an additional key to the type, which is get track success. And then finally, get tracks failure. Again, just to highlight the ES6 notation difference, you could rewrite error like you did tracks, and vice versa. So that's our synchronous action creators. And now it's time for the asynchronous action creators. So this is when you're making those calls to external services, or maybe you've got a node backend hooked up to a database. This is when this is going to come into play. So I typically like to define the actual call that I'm going to make, the request I'm going to make, in a separate file, in a separate folder even, fetch tracks by. So let's have a look at that. So we scroll down to services, fetch tracks. Here we go. So you can see here, we're just making a simple request to that endpoint, music match. And then if it's all good, hunky-dory, we just grab that tracks list, which is the array of all the songs, artists, and we return it. And the reason why it's good to extract it into sort of a separate file, into a separate function, is if you do want to do, say, server-side rendering, and you want to create your store, so on that initial load, you want it to have this initial data from this API endpoint, you can just reuse this function rather than having to rewrite it all over again. So I find it quite more efficient to extract it into a separate function. So we have now our defined call that we're going to make. Now it's time to actually create our asynchronous action creator. So it is going to be the job of this asynchronous action creator to actually call those actions, those synchronous actions, action creators that we saw earlier. So what is happening here? So you can see the other ones returned plain JavaScript objects, whereas here you're returning, in fact, another function, which you're passing the dispatch method. So just to quickly walk you through it, you have the fetch tracks method. And this is the fetch tracks asynchronous action creator. You then inside it, what's actually being turned now is a function. And when this function is called, we're first going to dispatch start get tracks. Makes sense? We're just about to make this call. And now we're going to make that call with the function we just created. If it's all great, then we can return it, and we're going to dispatch get track success. If it's been a little bit less so, we'll go into the catch, and we'll want to dispatch get tracks failure with that error message. And again, thinking about maybe what would you want to do with that? Would you want to log it to look into it later? So we've got now our asynchronous action creator. So just to hammer home the difference between the two. Synchronous action creators return plain JavaScript objects. They're pure functions, and what they're returning are actions. Whereas asynchronous action creators can return more complicated things such as functions and promises. And it's right here where you have your problem. So what is that problem? The problem is the store's dispatch method only knows how to dispatch actions, so only knows how to handle, how to process vanilla JavaScript objects. So finally, we can get a little bit thunk-y. Oh yeah. So Redux Thunk to the rescue comes in, and let's have a look at that. So what is Redux Thunk? It is a middleware. It's a middleware for Redux. It's an NPM package. So how this middleware works compared to maybe what you're accustomed to in sort of Express or libraries like that is this function is when it's invoked after an action has been dispatched, but before the reducer is called. So if you remember that first diagram that we saw, when an action is dispatched, it returns the action, and then that action is passed into the reducer, which is called. And what this does, it intervenes just at that point, just before you call the reducer, to handle the function or promise. So let's have a look at Redux Thunk. So I often got quite intimidated when I first started out looking at middleware. It seemed quite scary. But actually, what Redux Thunk is doing, this is pretty much it. It's not more complicated than this. So what is happening here? So Redux Thunk, the middleware, it gets past the store. And it gets past the store because it needs the dispatch method, and it needs the getState method. And then it calls the function and passes in next. And then it passes in action to the last function. And this action in the synchronous world are just JavaScript objects. But in our asynchronous action creator, it is now a function. So we'll go into it'll return true, and then it will be action store.dispatch store.getState. So if we have another look at our code, this is the action that's being returned. So then it is this action where we've passed in the dispatch, as you can see here, store.dispatch. And if it's not a function, it's just your Bob's your uncle action JavaScript object, you call next action, it continues on its merry little way. So that is really all Redux Thunk is doing. So again, just to sort of visualize where it's coming in, where it's coming into play, you have your components which dispatch action creators, but typically action creators, they end up returning actions, so dispatch actions. And it's right there that Thunk intervenes. It says, hang on, what are we returning? And it knows how to handle functions and promises. So we've looked at actions. I'm going to get to how we bring this into the app a little bit later on, so don't worry. So yeah, we've looked at actions, and I think it's time now to look at the next step in our journey, the reducers. So you'll probably be familiar with root reducers or just having one large reducer. I'm typically more of a fan of creating slice reducer functions. Each slice is responsible for updating just its own little part of the state. And what I like about this is you can often extract them out into maybe different files or clearly different functions. So when working in large teams, you're less likely to sort of be treading on each other's toes, which I find quite useful, as well as it's, for me, I find it it's quite more readable and easier to follow. So in the context of this app that we've got, what are the reducers? So the reducer's job is to update the state. So a slice reducer is to update just a little bit of the state. So thinking about our app, we have is fetching tracks. That makes sense. If it is fetching tracks, show this loader. We also have tracks. Yay, we've got some tracks, display it. And again, that, I'm not going to swear, fetch tracks failure. Show the error, or maybe log the error, whatever you want to do. So let's have a look at that code. So in our reducers folder, let's first look at is fetching tracks. So we have is fetching tracks. So this is our first slice reducer. And I want to point out that you don't need to have a default here. So you can see if state is undefined, the default for is fetching tracks will be false. There is another way to do it where you can, when you create the store, just pass in the initial state, but I've chosen to do it this way. So is fetching tracks. What's happening here? So an action has been dispatched. It's returned this action, which triggers the root reducer, which will contain all of these slice reducers, and each one of these slice reducers are going to be called. So this is called. We have the state, and we have our action. So let's say the action was get tracks. Well, we want to change is fetching tracks to true. And if it's get tracks success or get tracks failure, well, we've got our tracks, let's stop it, it's all good, is fetching tracks is now false. And if it's none of those actions, because you could have hundreds of actions, just return the state, don't do anything, this is none of your business. So that's is fetching tracks. Then we have our tracks. And again, on the initial load, we don't have any tracks, but let's have an empty array as our initial state. So that's our initial state for tracks. And again, all we care about is if it's been successful, only then will we get our tracks. Otherwise, just return the state. And finally, we have fetch tracks failure. So again, only time this is going to be called, or the only time that we actually want to update it, is when the action that's been dispatched is get tracks failure. Otherwise, just return the state. I've probably gone a bit extreme with the extracting of all these functions into different files, but it's just to give you an idea of how it works. So just to reiterate that, so you dispatch the action, which calls the root reducer. And then underneath, what's going on is each of these reducer functions, slice reducer functions that you've seen, gets called. And then the outcome, what's returned by all of them, is then rejoined into a single state. And ultimately, the state is updated in the store. So we've got all these individual slice reducers, but we need to create this one large gangster reducer. So one way of doing it is using this handy Redux method called combinedReducers. And yep, it does just that. And it creates this new higher order reducer function. So it returns the state of each reducer to form this single state object. Good to note, if you're using immutable.js at the very top level of your state, this function isn't your friend. However, it is actually quite a simple function what it's doing. So if we have a look, back in our reducers, I've created an index.js file which brings in all of these slice reducers. And again, ES6 notation, we're just passing it in. We're passing an object into combinedReducers. And what I want to highlight here is So the key is the same word as the reducer. So here, the key tracks is associated to the tracks reducer. And those keys are going to be the keys that are in your state or in your store. So if I change tracks to music time in my components, in my store, I would see music time, and there would be my empty array on the initial load. So those are the combined reducers. So now we've done our action creators, we've got our actions, we've got our reducers. Now we want to create store. So again, Redux obviously gives us a wonderful CreateStore method where you pass in this root reducer. And then you have the option to pass in other parameters. The first one is initial state, which I mentioned earlier I'm not going to do because I defined it as a default in each of the root reducers. And then the enhancer. And this is where the middleware comes in. So this is where it starts to get thunk-y again. So let's have a look at that. So where it's going to get thunk-y, we're going to use a Redux method called ApplyMiddleware. And let's have a look. So if we go to the root of our app, so index.js, so you can see here, this is the root of our React app. And we have our CreateStore and ApplyMiddleware that we've imported from Redux. And what are we doing? We pass in the reducers, which is the combined one of all of our slice reducers. Compose enhancers, I'll come back to that. I wanted to talk a bit about logging later, one of the benefits of using Redux, and specifically using Redux dev tools. And then we pass in ApplyMiddleware with our Redux Thunk. And it's here, in that ApplyMiddleware, that you could pass in other middlewares. So I've mentioned logging, if you need to keep track of everything for maybe audits, or maybe you want to have crash reports, because this is the perfect time. An action has happened. You've got an outcome, whatever that may be. What do you want to do with it? So it's the perfect time to apply middleware right there. So that's our store. And using the provider component, which is a specific React Redux method, we then pass in the store. So now our app has a store which contains the state, which has an initial load, which we defined in the default of all of our slice reducers. So this is where we're at. We've nearly come full circle. So we've now got a store, whoop-de-doo. But our components need to be able to connect to that store. It needs to be able to access the values. Crucially, it also needs to be able to call those methods, those dispatch those actions. So let's have a look at that. So again, Redux has the connect method. You can probably guess what it does. It also has MapState to, well, you create a MapState to props function, as well as a map dispatch to props. Again, it's pretty much in the name, but let's have a look. So I have my app component, which is the highest level. It doesn't need to be at the highest level. It's just the component which you want to be connected to the store. So I've created a container folder, and I'm going to create an app container. So your component app is just supposed to be this dumb component. It doesn't know anything about the store. It doesn't need to know anything about Redux, dispatch, none of that. All it needs to know is it needs to take these props. So, and it's here in the container that you extract all that logic, and you essentially hook it up to the store and pass down those props to that component. So what's going on here? So MapState to props. So again, ES6, we've got tracks, is fetching tracks, fetch tracks failure. So if we change the keys to, I can't remember what I said earlier, but hey, these are my tracks. tracks here would be changed to, hey, these are my tracks. And then you pass them down, you're returning it as an object. It's fetching tracks, tracks, fetch tracks failure. And then we have our map dispatch to props. So we've kind of forgotten about our asynchronous action creator. And it's here that we grab that bad boy. So map dispatch to props. We pass in the dispatch method that belongs to the store. And then I've used bind actions creators here, which is just another helpful Redux method. However, you don't need to. You could just do what I've done underneath. And essentially, yeah, you're just, what it says on the tin, you're mapping the dispatch, this particular asynchronous action creator, to props under the name fetch tracks. So that will be the prop name. And then you pass in those two functions to connect, and then whatever component that you're wanting to connect to the store, you pass it in at the end. So that's your app. So we're all connected now. We're all good to go. So what are the sort of benefits of Redux? I've done a question mark because a lot of people aren't that big a fan of the strict structure of it. So I find that there's increased consistency in code. It forces you to write in a certain way and to lay out your code in a certain way. That also can lead to, it's easier to maintain. And crucially, it's one source of truth, the store. I mentioned at the very beginning how, there are so many things now going on in your sort of single page app, it's really hard to keep track of everything. Whereas now, you just have that one source of truth. And then finally, and one of my sort of favorite reasons for using Redux is debugging. And I guess in some way it is linked to sort of the strict structure nature and how everything's going in this systematic order. And so for debugging, I often use Redux dev tools. So I thought I would maybe dive into the actual app that I created and give you a cheeky flash of Redux dev tools so you can see what's going on. So let's refresh that. Let's inspect. You can see there's a little Redux tab there. So what's going on? I haven't done anything. It's just loaded. And we've got the initial state there. And remember, we didn't pass in an initial state. This was just the default values in the reducers. So there you can see fetch tracks failure, empty string, is fetching tracks false, and tracks the empty array. So now what's going to happen when I type in, I don't know, what should we say? Let's start typing in thunk-y. So again, just to highlight, this is a very simplified version. I'm not taking into account sort of the ordering that these events happen, that these actions happen. But just to give you an idea, so we have typed in th and we've got these wonderful results. So now let's have a look at all these actions that have been dispatched. So first of all, when I first typed in that first letter, which was T, this action was dispatched, get tracks. So you can see we've got a lovely diff section here. You can see that change. The state now has it. Then we've got get track success. Again, you can see that diff. Is fetching tracks is now false, and we've got our lovely list of tracks. And what's also great about this is you can remove actions to see sort of where it's fallen down if you are trying to debug. So a lovely example here is, so you can see it says jump or skip, so I'm going to skip the success. I'm also going to skip this success, which was for the letter H. And there we go. You've just managed to change the state. And so you can really drill down and see, get into the debugging mindset. And I believe that is everything. Let's get thunking.